If there is a conflict in society, even at a structural level, there's a higher chance that there is a conflict also in the campaigns and politicians attack each other. What I do is investigate the dark side of politics, which means in political elites looking at whether or not they use attacks or incivility against each other. At the voter level, looking whether they disagree with each other, potentially even hate each other, and why. And looking, of course, at the intersection between the two, meaning looking at whether, if elites use dark politics, voters are more likely to hate each other. To understand whether negative campaigning is effective or not, we need to consider effective on what? And the answer is relatively tricky depending on what we focus on. For instance, if we consider the electoral effectiveness of negative campaigning, meaning whether or not when politicians attack each other, they win the election, the answer from the literature is not really. Meta-analysis seem to suggest that there is not a lot of effect. Sometimes politicians gain some votes when they attack each other. Sometimes they also lose some votes. Something very important to consider is that the public in general tend to dislike negative campaigning. All parties use negativity. It is not that parties on the left are more likely to go negative, on the right, on the center. Everyone uses negativity. This being said, in our research we have shown that there are three types of parties that seem to be using negativity, political attacks more often. First, more extreme parties, parties that are at the extreme of the ideological spectrum. These type of parties, most of the time they're also smaller, and they most of the time justify their existence as being antagonistic parties. Second type of parties that are more likely to go negative, and it's related to the first point, are populist parties. As we know, one of the key components of populism is an aggressive stance towards the system, elites, sort of this vertical conflict between the people and the elites that is articulated by populist movements. And because of that, populist movements and parties tend to engage quite often in more negative rhetoric. And finally, the third type of parties that are more likely to go negative are parties that are lagging behind in the polls. They tend to be slightly smaller, perhaps also populist, but not necessarily. If a party lags behind in the polls, it means that the chances that the party will win are very little, most of the time. There might be a surprise, but most of the time, lagging behind means low chances of winning. And if you have low chances of winning, what are the risks of going negative? Maybe people, voters, will dislike what you say, but you have nothing to lose. You already lost the election. So might as well be a little bit more sort of brave and aggressive. Maybe it will work for you. Worst case scenario, you're already losing. When it comes to Dutch elections, the first thing to say is that absolutely, negative campaigning, attack politics, and sometimes even incivility do exist in the Netherlands. All parties use negative campaigning in the Netherlands, some party more, some party less. Parties, furthermore, increasingly use negative campaigning and attacks against each other as the election day becomes close. As we know, parties towards the election tend to become more frantic and maybe realize that there are some undecided voters that they still have to convince or push away from other parties and so start attacking each other. This being said, if we take a step back and we look at the international picture, the Netherlands scores relatively low in comparison when it comes to negative campaigning. With colleagues, we have been collecting data about negative campaigning in elections across the world since 2016. And in this relatively big data set, we can now compare the level of negative campaigning across more than 180 elections. If we rank all these 180 elections across the world in terms of negativity, we see that the Netherlands arrive relatively low, around position 140, 150. And this is for both the two last elections, so 2017 and 2021 in the Netherlands. In other terms, plenty of negativity in the Netherlands, but in international comparison, not very high. In case you're interested, the country that tops this ranking of negativity is United States, most notably the 2016 election, which I'm sure you remember, Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump, the most negative election in your data set. What negative campaigning seems to have an effect on is to increase divisions in society. Most notably, there is some preliminary evidence that shows that increasing levels of attacks between elites creates in the public a deeper division between ideological camps. So divisions in the elite not simply create ideological divisions in the public, they also create what we call affective polarisation, which is on top of disagreeing with your opponents, you also dislike them and sometimes even hate them. Unfortunately, when it comes to the consequence of negative campaigning, on top of this potentially increasing societal division, an even nastier and dramatic consequence is the rise of political violence. Political violence is unfortunately increasing in all countries. In the US, of course, we can think of several episodes of political violence: assassination of Abe Shinzo in Japan, assassination attempts against presidential candidates in Brazil, physical attacks against politicians in the Netherlands very recently. Political violence is everywhere. And what our research seems to suggest is that exposing people to campaign messages that are nasty and uncivil, so once again, when politicians attack each other, seem to create in respondents not only a dislike towards their opponent, but also an increased propensity towards harming them physically, or at the very least, supporting when nasty things happen to political opponents.